morning, and welcome to History Matters, and so does coffee, which I almost had the ultimate faux pas on History Matters and forgot to put the cover on, and I was going to pick it up and drink out of it. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about Ukraine, France and the revolution, a bunch of things. See how that all weaves together. But before I begin those things, I turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who will now explain the rules of the game.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Annie. I'm with the New American History Project, and I am delighted, as always, to be with you on a Friday morning. If y'all can see behind me, I'm zooming in today from Norfolk, Virginia, getting ready to spend the holiday with my family in Williamsburg. But today we are excited to be live over winter break. Some of you are joining us in person. Many of you are teachers or at work and typically watch this on a recording. So it's always fun around holiday times when people can be with us and engage in the chat. If you're with us here on Zoom or on Facebook. And in about a half an hour after Joanne talks about the topic she just mentioned, we will engage in the Q&A. And the way that that magic happens is when lovely people like you add really good questions. So we love the chat, but it goes by really fast. So we really need you to put your questions that are related to today's topic in the Q&A, and then we'll see you in about a half an hour.
And I'm going to add to what Annie just said that sometimes around this time of year, I have pre-recorded an episode because it's Christmas time and then it's New Year's, and often I'm on the road. This year I'm not on the road, and Annie and John were kind enough to say, yeah, like we'll be there for it. So I'm saying this partly because they're amazing for being willing to do this, and partly because I don't know if I've done a live pre-Christmas, pre-New Year's episode before. So here we are. Okay, so today's topic, today's topic, I'm not going to go where I just was going to go because the person might be listening. Okay, you got to be careful. So I did, given Zelensky's address before Congress earlier this week, it made me think, as a historian would, about France and not really the American Revolution, but Americans and their feeling towards France post-revolution, and what happened when there was the French Revolution going on in France and all that was going on there, and the fact that it divided some Americans on what they thought about what was going on in France. I want to talk about that today. I also want to talk about, and I'll circle back to this at the end, how there might be differences between what politicos and the politically minded at the top of the hierarchy think about such matters and what the American people think about such matters. And that will enable me to loop Lafayette into this conversation as well. So I'm gonna do all of that and then bring it full circle at the end, and you can watch and see if I actually managed to do this. I was rummaging around this morning trying to figure out the best way to do this. Okay. But first, when I posted this topic on 800 social media platforms last night, some people said, and it was a very logical question, who doesn't support Ukraine? Right? I said, some people support Ukraine, some people don't. And they said, who doesn't support Ukraine? And I said, oh, some on the right. So I have some quotes for you. And it's some on the right, and it's very specific in some cases. So first, I will quote Tucker Carlson in 2019, quote, "Why do I care what's going on in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia? I'm serious. And why shouldn't I root for Russia?" Which I am. Okay, that's one. Then we have Matt Getz yesterday, I believe, 2 days ago on Twitter. "President Zelensky should be commended for putting his country first." You get where that's going. "But American politicians who indulge his requests are unwilling to do the same for ours. Hemorrhaging billions of taxpayer dollars for Ukraine while our country is in crisis is the definition of America last. He did not change my stance on suspending aid for Ukraine and investigating fraud in transfers already made." Okay, so Getz says, yeah, Zelensky's fine. I'm going to make this entirely partisan, and that's how I'm going to respond to this current moment. So part of what I'm going to be talking about today, logically enough, is revolutions wars, fighting for democracy in other countries, and the different ways that Americans respond and that American leadership, but the political elite respond, and why. So thinking about taking you back now to revolutionary France. Now, of course, the first thing I'll say, historical context being always important, is that obviously the case, you can't equate exactly America and Ukraine and America and France in 1793, because France, of course, had been our allies during the American Revolution, had stepped forward and supported our war against Great Britain, in part, of course, because France and Great Britain were enemies forever, but also they stepped forward. Lafayette, Marquis de Lafayette, came famously to the colonies and then the United States with ships, with men and guns, and I don't remember the Hamilton lyric, but some of you out there do, with ships, and now I'm going to try and think of it through this whole episode, but at any rate, and so the battleships with guns and ships, and so the battleships, okay, that's actually kind of scary. At any rate, so there is a difference between the America-France relationship and the America-Ukraine relationship, but what's worth thinking about is that what was going on in France in the 1790s and what's going on in Ukraine now was perceived now and then in one way or another as a fight for democracy. So sticking ourselves back in the late 1790s, the French Revolution obviously is against the French monarchy, and it's a revolution about what kind of government France is going to have. And it was initially not a violent revolution, and then ultimately a very violent revolution. I meant to look this up, and I believe this to be true, and one of you brilliant people who are Google meisters who find things in negative 2 seconds can find this out. But I believe that the word terrorism is born of the French terror during the French Revolution. I know John Adams, I quoted this before, John Adams uses the word terrorism to refer to this time period in the United States when he's writing a letter to Thomas Jefferson in the early 19th century. But one of you can then discover and tell me if I am correct, but I think it must be. Where else would John Adams get the word terrorism from in like 1814? But at any rate, so it's very violent, and not surprisingly, there were very strong reactions from, I'm going to start with elite political figures and then the American people. Elite political figures had very strong reactions to what was going on in France. And of course, strong reactions entirely grounded in what they were thinking about the United States. So on the one hand, you had the Federalists who, how would I sum them up quickly? Were not exactly democracy friendly, right? They weren't very comfortable with mass popular politics in the streets, like elections, okay, but they weren't happy with popular upset. They wanted famously, again, a strong national government that whenever it appeared in public would appear, as Hamilton put it, as a Hercules, right? They're looking at what's happening in France, and what they're seeing is, in their minds, rioting in the streets, bloodshed, chaos, like some kind of social upset that they were worried would be a contagion. And you'll see why I'm putting down my papers in a moment. A contagion, and would spread to the United States, and there would be social upset in the United States, and precisely what was going on in France would happen here. And the Federalists, all about this strong centralized power, couldn't imagine something worse. I put my papers down because to me, the ultimate example of this feeling on the part of Federalists that they did not like what was going on, and I'm going to come back to in a moment, we're actually didn't feel so bad about the King of France, generally speaking. Hamilton, and I know I've talked about this before, probably more than once, so humor me. But he did, in I believe 1793, draw up what do I want to call it? A seal for the United States. And first of all, why? He never did anything with this. He sat down and said, make a memo for a seal of the United States. But what it's like the most, if Freud existed then, it would be Freudian. It's like the most open glimpse of, the screaming anxiety in Federalist Hamilton's brain at that moment. His view of what a seal of the United States should be is, and this is a bad paraphrase, he's like, imagine there's a globe, And on one side of the globe is North America, and on the other side of the globe that you can see at least is Europe. And in North America, you have Liberty with a shield facing towards Europe. And in Europe, you have a giant figure, right? A huge giant clothed in the traditional clothing of the French Revolution, wearing a liberty cap, carrying various symbols of the French Revolution, with one foot in France and the other foot crossing the ocean and hovering over North America. And liberty is North America. Like, can you imagine? Like, this is what I want our national seal to be. Screaming panic at the contagion of the French Revolution. What was in his brain? I do not know. But what I love about that is it captures precisely what I'm talking about here, which is whatever was going on there was bad, was scary, was anti-hierarchical in some way. You know, there are various newspaper accounts at the time, Federalist newspaper accounts at the time that describe the King of France as, you know, such a humane and gentlemanly king, right? That why? This is crude. This is horrible. Horror of horrors on the side of the Federalists. Bad. And why are they revolting against their king anyway, really? I mean, he's a good king, right? He's not like our former king. He's a good king. So that's the Federalists. On the side of the Republicans, the Jeffersonian Republicans, some of them do become upset as the blood begins to flow in revolutionary France, but others look at what's happening in France and immediately link it with what the United States or what the colonies did in revolting against England and creating a new nation. And even more sort of egocentric, many Republicans in the United States believe that the American Revolution set off a spark of liberty, which is going to spread around the globe. And what's happening in France is the first sign that this is true. Look what we did, the United States. We set off the spark of liberty, and look, France picked it up. Isn't this wonderful? And I didn't go and find them, but some of you probably already know these Jefferson quotes. He's like, what's a little blood on the tree of liberty? You know, the outcome is so important, right? Jefferson was very much there with his sort of lofty, not very grounded in what's going on the ground rhetoric about the importance of what was going on in France. We have him here. Let me find the quote here. We've just received here the news of the decapitation of the King of France. Should the present foment in Europe not produce republics everywhere, it will at least soften the monarchical governments by rendering monarchs amenable to punishment like other criminals and doing away the rages of insolence and oppression stemming from the inviolability of the king's person. Okay, we just heard that the King of France was decapitated, and you know, that might have a good impact. It's essentially what Jefferson is saying. This is from 1793. There's also a really famous quote that more than one of my students put in their papers, which I discovered when I was trying to recover the quote this morning, and I went into Word and searched on a keyword from the quote, and several student papers came up. I was like, hey, look at that. The National Gazette, which is the Jeffersonian Republican newspaper of the 1790s, in 1793, and I'm going to do the pronunciation here wrong because I have never taken Latin, had in the newspaper, Louis Capet has lost his caput. Capet would have been his last name if kings used last names. Caput in Latin, probably pronounced miserably by me, means head, right? So the National Gazette is like, the king just lost his head. And then goes on to say, from my use of this pun, it may be seen that I think lightly of his fate. I certainly do. It affects me no more than the execution of another malefactor. Okay, so many Republicans are looking at this and saying, okay, this spread of liberty, things are more democratic. This is excellent. My larger point here is that among the elite, the political elite, what we're seeing is highly partisan, highly tied up in contemporary politics. And so people on one side, on, I suppose today, what we might consider in some ways to be the right, are not entirely sure that they want to they kind of like the king, right? Like, first of all, we don't really know what this revolution is about. The king's okay. He's not so bad. Why are they revolting against him? And are really unhappy with all that whatever's going on there represents and what it will do to the United States. And on the other side, on the side of what now we might label, and these labels are problematic, so I'm using them and wincing as I do so, but the more liberal side, the Republican side, the more liberal folk are saying, yay, like, look at that, the spread of democracy, and France is following us, and we support what that represents. Okay, so first of all, you have conservatives looking on and being entirely unsure and kind of partly siding with people being revolted against. And you have others who on the political elite looking on and saying, like, yes, like, it's so important to defend that mode of political change. Now that brings us to the American people. What do the American people think about what was going on in France? And I did not do an in-depth study, so I'm giving you broad sweeping statements about this. But generally speaking, the American people supported what was going on in France, not because it was violent, not because they supported violence, but because the French, again, represented our allies from the French Revolution. They seemed to be doing what the Americans had done with their own revolution. They felt had like a heart tie with France, you know, a sort of kinship feeling with France. And so generally speaking, they were friendly to what was going on there. And this is a very general statement, and certainly this was not true of everyone. But a lot of Americans were happy with what was going on. And you can see that in part with the response, again, in 1793, which is clearly a key year here. I had a friend in grad school, and he got so involved in his dissertation with the events of 1793, which is a big year, that we used to jokingly say, is your dissertation going to be called 1793, the year? There's so much going on. But 1793 was also the year when citizen Edmond Genet came from France to the United States, basically looking for aid from Americans to support French wars against Britain and Spain. And this became very, very controversial because Genet essentially went over Washington's head straight to the American people and appealed to them directly. Can you give me aid? You know, can you give us ships? What can you give us? Which is problematic when a foreign country representative does that to the American people without really consulting with the American government. But the response, my point here is that there was a huge popular response. There were parades, there were dinners, there were celebrations, there was oratory and speeches and proclamations. He received a welcome address from the French Benevolent Society in Philadelphia that declared the United States has a great attachment to the nation you represent, of their zeal for the cause of liberty and equality, and of their personal regard, right? So Genet comes and Americans pour their feelings about France in the midst of the revolution on Genet, which gives you a sense at least of the popular sensibility about France in general. Now, Lafayette, at this moment, he doesn't necessarily fare very well. And I linked him with Zelensky. You'll see why when I circle back around to this in a moment. So Lafayette kind of tries to walk, again, great hero of the American Revolution. Americans love the Marquis de Lafayette. He becomes a kind of hero of the liberal aristocrats. So he's walking kind of a middle line. He's an opponent of the slave trade. He's an advocate of religious toleration, but he's still an aristocrat. So it's a difficult line to walk. And for a little while, he manages it and then ultimately does not manage it. And as the revolution advances and becomes more violent, and as he is not as successfully walking this line, he flees the country, ends up in Austria, and he's held captive until 1797. And even with this, whatever's going on, and the fact that Lafayette was sort of, you know, friendly towards royalists, Americans never surrendered their love of Lafayette. And so you have, for example, a quote from James Monroe, which is typical of many, in which he writes to someone again in 1793 or maybe 4, and says, oh no, it's probably a little bit later, roughly around this time period. I brilliantly didn't write down the date. I scarcely find a man unfriendly to the French Revolution. Many regret the unhappy fate of the Marquis de Lafayette, and likewise the execution of the king. but they seem to consider these events as incidents to a much greater one, and which they wish to see accomplished. So they still love Lafayette, but the larger vision, what's going on in France is wonderful, and it affirms the United States, and they're our great allies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see that the American people, in one way or another, kind of stand by France, although the political elite, seeing through a partisan lens in one way or another, or through a highly ideological / partisan lens, are judging what's going on in France through that lens, and whether they're writing for newspapers or delivering oratory or making, written addresses of sorts, are very much talking about France within a frame of what's going on in the United States. Much like Matt Getz saying, well, Zelensky, good guy, but generally speaking, I will now talk about this as a Republican. That the American people are doing one thing, the political elite are doing another. I want to circle back to Lafayette here because, as I suggested a moment ago, love of Lafayette never falters, even when he's walking this middle line during the French Revolution. And in 1824, he comes back to the United States to do kind of a victory lap, right? The elderly Lafayette. And if you're ever curious about this, totally go and find it online, because it's wildly enthusiastic, this reception of Lafayette. And there are all of these sort of staged scenes set up, right? Let's bring him back and have him meet up in a way that we can see with Jefferson, like, the two revolutionaries meeting up, and all of these, early 19th century, it's a huge big deal. I think at one point in the distant past, I tweeted back in the uncomplicated days of Twitter, a sort of celebratory glove that was like Tour of Lafayette on the back of the glove. I mean, that was huge. And he traveled around, and apparently many, many, many American cities were suddenly named Lafayette in 1824. It was huge, and Americans adored him for his link to the American Revolution, adored him for his link to France, which again, Americans still saw as reaffirming in some way what America represented. This is why I thought of Lafayette when I thought of Zelensky. Who is the first foreign citizen to address the House of Representatives? The Marquis de Lafayette. He is the first. December 10th, 1824. So not even that distant if you're marching back in time. December of 1824. I didn't, again, have time this morning to calculate. But at any rate, he is a foreigner who comes to represent in his person liberty, amity, a foreign country fighting for democracy. He embodies, in some way or another, American sentiment about another country and what Americans saw as happening in that other country. My larger point here, put that down. My larger point here is, we're seeing, or certainly I'm seeing, on the one hand, like Representative Getz, some people on the left and right who are elites saying a lot about what's going on in Ukraine, and even in some cases about Zelensky, though that's trickier territory. Even Matt Getz didn't want to step on that ground, but some even are calling him I think someone, maybe it was Tucker Carlson at some point called him a tyrant. Not sure where that came from. But at any rate, we are seeing the political elite and media elite commenting on what's going on, and some of them very negative in what they're saying, particularly thinking about it's handy, I guess is the word I'll use, for them to be able to say, why are we giving our aid to these people, bad Democrats, and Democrats saying, but look, they're fighting for democracy. Now, the fact of the matter is, it is true that Russia is just sort of declaring war on a sovereign nation and then declaring that they are no longer sovereign. That is highly problematic to just the idea of democracy and national sovereignty. So it's very hard to point to that and say, or it should be very hard to point to that and say, yeah, I'm with Russia. It's like Russia is doing something seriously problematic and seriously threatening to democracy writ large. That is a fact. But a lot of that talk is happening on an elite level. And I didn't copied down these polls that I saw online because they were a year or two old, and I didn't have time to find a recent poll. But polls from a year or so ago suggested that 70-something% of Americans supported Ukraine and the people of Ukraine and what was going on there. Again, I don't know if that's similar now or if it's shifted or how much partisanship has altered that. That I don't know. But the general idea is that the American people, a majority of the American people, support Ukraine and the people of Ukraine for what's going on, and that hasn't dramatically changed over time. My point here is you see what the political elite are doing. You hear what the political elite are saying. It's everywhere. And depending on your politics, you're going to be more open to hearing one or the other. And it's easy to mistake the elite for the all. And my point here is the all is bigger. The all might be harder to get. But just because you're hearing people, Tucker Carlson or others, who are declaring Russia the good guy and Ukraine the bad guy, or someone on the left saying more money to Ukraine. Personally, I support that, but you don't have to support that. My larger point here is the American people, the majority of the American people believe what they believe. And we have to remember not to mistake the loud elite voices for the whole. And I've said before, the majority of Americans think one thing, and we sometimes take the loudness of the voices and the extremeness of some of these voices, and in some cases, the violence inherent in some of these voices, and see that as representing a majority. It doesn't necessarily represent a majority. It might be a really loud minority, and it's so important to remember that, because if you think it's the majority, you might be discouraged from standing up and acting, from defending what you think, from stepping forward and fighting for, by fight, I mean politically working for what you believe in. Don't mistake what the elite are saying for what the nation is or thinks. They are not the same thing. Not easy to know, to get a read on what the nation thinks. And social media makes you think that you know that, but it's not representative, and we all know that. It's loud, particularly on Twitter, loud voices and voices who are favored by people who have particular power in relation to Twitter get magnified, right? Or are more likely to be loud on Twitter. Always remember that what you believe is not necessarily impossible or a minority or something that's not worth thinking about. It's always worth defending and working for democracy, liberty, say even the Constitution. Don't ever believe that the naysayers represent a majority. They are a loud group of people, but you need to remember that the American people think as a whole, generally, regarding some things differently. That's certainly the case for Ukraine, just as it was for France. So remember, I guess the one-line version of this before I open things up to question, what you think matters, what you think counts. Don't allow yourself to be drowned out by the loud voices being guided by partisanship. Okay, mug. I'm trained for that. Okay, this is actually a related mug that I almost, again, committed the ultimate faux pas. Get my lipstick off of here. I actually bought it at the Musée du Cheval in France. And it is French chevalier from the 18th century. It is, and the Musée du Cheval was like, there was horsemanship, they were like parading around these animals with amazing skill. I was there. It was like the founders in France, like one of these Yale tours where I came along as the professor and gave lectures while we did things largely in Paris. But at any rate, it's pretty related, right? It's as close as I could get to France and the French Revolution. So in one way or another, you could put this image in your mind as what would have been going on at the time period. Okay, I've got to open chat so I could see people. Annie has not returned. so I don't know what the questions are.
I am here. I was waiting for your mug.
Oh, okay, yes.
I like the mug. That was a good one. Okay, we have some questions. So our friend Harvey Simon asks, did Thomas Paine admonish George Washington and others for conspiring with England against France around 1796?
So Paine did denounce Washington, and Paine, he becomes a controversial figure. So part of the answer to that is yes. He did denounce Washington. I think also in part, if I remember this correctly, and I didn't look it up, I think in part for not working to free Lafayette too. I think. But yes, Paine did. This did not make him popular among many Americans for denouncing George Washington. I mean, more people were more willing to do that during Washington's second term than they were during his first term. And that became more true throughout the 1790s. But even so, attacking George Washington was kind of risky. Thomas Paine was a risky guy, but he really lost favor with Americans. And I tell the story in my American Revolution course. He was, get this straight. Now I'm going to get the direction wrong. I think he was buried in the United States. He's buried. No, I get this is even worse. He is not buried at first, and his bones are being kept in a trunk that is passed on from someone to someone, and it's just his bones are like discovered at some point, and I don't know why they're not buried, but then they begin talking about a burial. I don't remember why this happens. And either he was going to be buried in England and he was in America, or he's going to be buried in America and he was in England, but the crate and the bones are put on a ship and then they vanish. And we don't know where Thomas Paine's bones are. And every year when I do my American Revolution course, and I haven't taught that course in a while, so again, you Google experts here. When I teach that course, I go online and I'm like, did they find Thomas? And I think
you make sure they didn't find him since the last time.
I need to know. You never know. But I believe he's still missing, Thomas Paine. So anyway, but the larger point of that is his feelings about him in the United States were mixed. I think maybe America didn't want him and was going to send him back to England, might be the way this story goes. But at any rate,
Tim says he's still missing.
Look at that, Carol Lee. Paine is still missing. The update. Thank you. Carol Lee has the bones of Thomas Paine.
That'd make a great lesson, Carol Lee, around Halloween when you want to do something kind of creepy.
Where are the bones of Thomas Paine?
Where's
Yeah.
the bones?
I feel slightly weirded out by that, and also very sorry for him.
Yeah.
That,
it's almost like he can't rest his soul. He's traveling around the world.
There's a great movie that who's the one who does the Halloween Bride?
Tim Burton.
Tim Burton.
That would be a good Tim Burton film.
Exactly.
Bones.
Yeah, he didn't think that would be happening. So
yeah. Okay. No one wants to bury him. Wow. All right, we've got more questions. This one comes from our friend Beth, Rabbi Beth. And we love this one. She put it in the chat originally, and then Carolee and I were like, no, this needs to go in Q&A. She asked, is Zelensky the Ukrainian Lafayette, or is Ukraine the American colonies and we are their France? If the latter, does that put President Biden in the role of Lafayette?
Oh, yikes. Okay, I don't think, I got to think this one through piece by piece. So is the first half is Zelensky our Lafayette?
Yeah.
If you're talking about Lafayette in 1824, Lafayette would have been more complicated during the actual French Revolution. So that direct comparison becomes trickier to make. He is, in the sense that he becomes this foreign figure who's representative of democracy in some way and is celebrated and loved, and then testifies before Congress, gives a speech before Congress. In that sense, yes. But in an immediate sense, no. But then what's the
other part said, or is Ukraine the American colonies and we are their France?
Oh. Ooh, that's interesting. Well, I mean, I suppose you could say we are their France in the sense that we're an established country with money. They are under attack and desperate for aid and support. Sort of as far as ships and money, but also support as far as a major nation standing behind them. So in a way, I suppose you could say that we're acting kind of in the role of a France towards Ukraine, which is really interesting. Which then leads to the question, and this might have been the third part of it, right? If we are
part was Biden and Lafayette, then does that make
I was going right there, right?
Biden exactly what she had. Oh, that was a great question.
Right. I don't know. I don't know. It's a really interesting question that in a way I can't answer, in part because we're so in the middle of it.
Yeah.
Right. That I don't know, but certainly by a certain argument, you could say, if by that you mean he's the person who is a figure of authority, and he's stepping forward and offering aid, I suppose you could say he is a Lafayette figure, but he's also the head of a country and not like an American stepping forward who's not the head of a country and just being like, I believe in your cause. I don't know who that person would be or if we have that person yet.
I wonder if I put an appointment on my calendar for the first Friday in January of 2024, like a year out, and we revisit this question.
That would be wonderful.
I'm going to do that.
Do it. There are many things we should revisit depending on how long we go on. There are many things that I talked about at this point 2 years ago that would be worth thinking about, but even things that are talking about now, because, you know, what we talk about here is explicitly directly linked with what's happening now. And I'm sure if I went back and rewatched 2-year-old episodes, I'd be thinking, ooh, like, that's not what happened. I think differently now. It would be really interesting to kind of look back in that way. Biden would be the king. Biden could be, right? Wow. Biden, the guy who's, yeah. Wow. That's interesting. That's Clinton. Thank you, Clinton.
Wow.
And someone said that Thomas Paine lived in New Rochelle. Yes, I knew that, indeed. I went, this is a very Yale story related to Thomas Paine, but early on, when I first came to Yale and I was doing my revolution course, and I went into the stacks because I wanted to find something in the stacks that would enable me to talk in a personal way, finding something that someone said from the time period so that I could pull it into my lecture. And what I found in the stacks was a pamphlet from Paine's lifetime that someone had written about Paine. I was like, oh, this is from 1792. And I carried it in the classroom. I was like, cool quote. And this was sitting in the library. And afterwards, actually, not because of me, Yale went and very carefully took their older volumes that were just sitting in the library and put them in a different spot. But at any rate, I'm sorry. No, what is someone, we can wait till the after party about a song.
Yeah, there are more song requests.
Okay.
Okay.
More questions.
We have more questions. Okay. Tim is asking, was Lafayette ever criticized for the clothing he wore? We seem to get distracted by tan suits and military fatigues.
Was Lafayette criticized for his clothing?
Yeah, after he was criticized for the clothes he wore.
Oh, I don't think so. I mean, he was an aristocrat. Part of what people loved during the revolution was that an aristocrat came and supported the cause of, well, what would have been called the cause of democracy, but a fight against tyranny. So I don't think they were complaining about his dress. There's probably something out there that I'm not thinking about, but it certainly wasn't a big trend. People did talk all the time about what American politicians, men, wore. It made fun of them if they were wearing like too much lace because that suggested they were monarchists. I've talked about this before, I know. John Adams having too much lace on his clothing and saying that he can't afford to buy new plainer clothing, which just shows you what a pretense, what a performance it is. But I don't think so yet. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I definitely think Zelensky's wardrobe was a conscious choice the other night, for sure.
Oh, for sure. Oh, for sure. I mean, yeah, you know, it was part of his statement, right?
Yeah.
1 year representing a people at war.
Yep.
Of course he would do that. And of course it would be attacked. But there's the image of him sitting with former President Trump that everyone keeps putting on there, and he's wearing a suit and a tie. So he can if he wants to. I didn't see this as disrespectful as some did. I saw it as a very strong statement about precisely where his country is and that he is there with his country.
Like, I didn't even have time to change, and I'm flying right back after this speech, and I have to be ready.
Yeah. And I am with them. I am not above them.
Exactly. Okay, we've got more questions. Tom asks, if Joanne, if you were equating modern leaders with those from the 1790s, who would you say was a comparable figure to Putin in the 1790s? Ooh.
Oh, in the 1790s. That's a good question. I'm not entirely sure how I would answer that because the King of England no longer loomed large in a way. I don't think Russia was enormously in the American mind at that point. Sarah Alexander, I mean, maybe I'd have to think about that. I'm sure there's someone that would have stood tall and representing bad to the United States at the time, but I'm not entirely sure who that single leader would be. And I don't know if it would be Sarah Alexander. I'm not sure. I will stick with I'm not sure.
All right, that we might have to revisit that in a year.
Exactly.
All right, Dave asks, he said base again on Rabbi Bess in the chat. Oh, he put the same question in. Okay, Dave, we've already answered that one, sorry. All right, guys, we need more questions. How did we clear the deck so fast?
I know, I'm shocked.
We've never cleared the deck when we still had 10 minutes to go.
I actually see a lot of discussion of bingo, which I'm not going to say out loud because you guys, I always get like joked into, like, has she said this yet? And then I'm like, no, I haven't said this. I just said.
People were talking though about Zelensky visiting the front before he flew to DC.
Well, the symbolism of that act, the power of that act, and you're right, the clothing being a part of the statement of what he did, the fact that he yoked American history into his address, right? Again, very clearly making a link, linking what's happening in Ukraine with what happened in the past, the American Revolution. I mean, all of this is very savvy. What he was doing was a message with a clear intent. The interesting part, or among the things that are interesting, is the fact that he was invited to do this and did this, and that we watched, and it was before Congress. It doesn't necessarily happen that often. I mean, as I suggested, it's not that Lafayette was the only person before this that served in that role and spoke before Congress, but it's an honor to be asked to speak before the US Congress, and now, given media, in essence, to speak to the nation. So that's actually pretty extraordinary. I couldn't watch the whole thing. I don't remember what I was doing, and I felt like a historian who is like not doing my duty, because I always very much try to witness events that are going on when they're televised, just to witness them in part, and to think about what they mean that they are being televised, to think about what the audience is seeing as they're watching, and to think about how technology is shaping how we're understanding the present. Those are all questions that always really interest me as a historian. And in this case, I failed. And there was even someone online somewhere, some social media platform, that was like, are you watching? And I was like, I can't watch, and I am a historian failure. I
felt like that as a teacher. Like, I always felt like I had to watch a State of the Union address, so that the next day I could respond to kids' questions, or the January 6 hearings or whatever was going on. I think that's just in an educator's DNA. Okay, so Lawrence, our good friend Lawrence, has a question. He asks, he's interested in your thoughts, Joanne, on the relation between Lafayette's tour, the 50th anniversary of American independence, and Tocqueville's observations of his tour for democracy in America.
Well, that's really interesting. Certainly Lafayette, if you're talking about two French people experiencing the United States in roughly the same time period, they both certainly saw a very engaged American people. In the case of Lafayette, very engaged and focused on him. But in the case of Tocqueville, he came away, when you read Democracy in America, he came away talking a lot about associations and clubs and how America may be spread over a big territory, but the fact of the matter is they have these endless clubs and associations that they meet in that in one way or another are the networks, the core of democracy, and that's where American people come together and do things. And so I suppose you could say that both Lafayette and Tocqueville kind of saw that, but Tocqueville was thinking as a scholar in a sense, it was a sociological point of view, and Lafayette was just lapping it up and loving the attention. And I suppose, what's interesting, actually, this is particularly interesting. When I was working on my first book, I was very interested to see what France was thinking about what was going on in the United States as the government began, 1789, 1790, 1791, because I wanted an outside opinion on what was going on, right? There's in some ways, there's no better way to step back from something and see what it looks like than to find an outsider looking in. And so no matter who I was looking at in the United States at the time, it was a foreign observer who would be the one who would say something you didn't expect, and who would lead you to see something very differently. And in the case of the French, it was fascinating because they, generally speaking, they understood that some of what was going on in the United States was for show, right? So there's famously when Jefferson becomes president and he's dressed very plainly, and the rundown slippers that he sometimes met people with. He was very much performing, I am a simple, plain, small r Republican. Like, I am not monarchical in my tastes at all. And the French looked on and said, well, that's so clearly an act, because he was here in France. And we know what the guy can dress like. Like, he didn't dress like that in France. So we know he's making a point. They didn't necessarily disapprove of it, but it was like, yeah, okay, that's an act. The other thing that the French commented on, particularly earlier on, was that Americans couldn't entirely divest themselves of their British past. And so there was one French observer in like 1790 or 1791 who the French were very interested, obviously, for a variety of reasons about what was going on in the United States. But there was some leftover custom and culture of England that they could perceive. And one French observer called it British rust. You can see the British rust still coating whatever's going on in the United States. They're still figuring it out. I think one of them said they're walking on a tightrope trying to figure out what they're doing, but there's this British rust corroding everything about them. So the French, in a way, are kind of ideal observers from this time period. On the one hand, looking in, perceived as friends, and on the other hand, undergoing their own conversation about how democratic their government should be, can be, is. That's a really good way to get insight about what the United States looked like when you take a step back in this time period.
Yeah. British Rust. That's a new garage band name, I think.
Well, and Miriam has a good point. We still have British Rust in our fascination with the monarchy. Our interest in the monarchy is, I don't fully understand it, but it's fascinating. So yeah, that might be some British Rust.
Yeah. Okay. So we have new questions. Our friend Rich, whose internet keeps going in and out, but somehow he managed to add a question. Rich says, why isn't there more focus and discussion on the original invasion and annexation of Crimea in this current situation?
That I can't answer. It's a really good question. And if someone has an answer, throw it on in. But I don't know. I don't know if it partly has to do with Ukraine very effectively garnering attention and making a message. I don't know. But it's an interesting question. Here,
So-
Timothy Snyder's lectures may answer that question. My colleague Tim Snyder's lectures. Yeah, I have not watched Tim's lectures, but I know they are lurking out there, and he is an authority on this. So that would be a place to look.
And I'm sure Tim will put a link to Timothy Snyder's lectures here in a minute for us. Okay, so Tim also asked about drawing any parallels between Zelensky and Churchill.
Ooh. Well, I mean, in the most basic and obvious way, as someone who culturally, popularly can project something about a nation that the nation loves and that outsiders respect, that's not easy, right? That's not an easy thing to do, particularly two ways. Your people admire it and foreign countries respect and admire it. Zelensky's definitely really good at that. He's a fascinating figure. You don't need me to say that, but I'll be intrigued as this continues to unfold. I'll be intrigued in, let's say, 10 years to find something to read that looks back on this period and looks at Zelensky and democracy, and kind of evaluates not just the impact he had on it, but the way in which he was in a conversation about democracy and shaping the conversation about democracy. Really, really interesting figure, explicitly because he's so good at making a message, spreading a message, embodying the message that he wants to spread. He's a really interesting figure.
I wonder how much of that comes from his life as a performer before that.
I was going to say that has to be part of it, and that's really interesting too. And I have not, Tom, and I'm not going to say it now. Tom wants to know if I said
so bad. They're tricky. Okay, Miriam, our dear friend Miriam, who hasn't been with us as much recently, so we're so happy to have Miriam back. Miriam says, do you think there's a historical parallel to the talk from a number of Republicans about the use of money for Ukraine versus spending it on domestic needs?
Repeat the question for me.
Is there a historical parallel to talk from the Republicans about using money for aid to Ukraine as opposed to taking care of our own domestic needs?
Well, I mean, I think this is going to be a really, in a way, superficial answer, but I think generally speaking, if the in party is doing anything with money regarding foreign nations, it's a really easy way for the out party to complain. Right? They're giving money to blah, blah. Why aren't they spending it on blah, blah? So strategically, it's hard. I would assume that the answer to that has to be yes, of course, because it makes sense in a partisan way, depending on the foreign power that's being talked about. That's like low-hanging fruit, right? If you're trying to find something to attack your enemies for, spending money elsewhere and not spending it on the United States, regardless of whether there's actual anything beneath that charge. But as an idea, that's seemingly an easy one to toss around and that you have an emotional response to, as I've talked about so often here. If you have a strong emotional response to something, always step back and think about whether someone really wants you to have a strong emotional response to something, and whether you're being manipulated in some way. But the short answer to that is, yeah, there has to be an equivalent in one way or another, just because of how strategic and effective that would be, but I can't necessarily put my finger on one in the 120 seconds that we have left before we're done with the Q&A. I'm looking to catch up too with what's going on. Yeah, that's particularly, Jen says that doesn't carry much more since Republicans don't really want to spend it on domestic matters anyway. Well, that's what I wasn't going to say, but yes. So it's low-hanging fruit because it's a claim you can make if you're on the out and you're trying to attack the party that's in spending money, but it's not necessarily a claim that you can make that claim and really not have much support for it. They see that a lot these days. So in the case of the current day, it doesn't really, well, there's a great case of emotional manipulation, right? Yeah, America first.
Yeah.
That's, you can say that and feel that and not really be thinking about the underpinnings of that.
Okay, we've got one last question for the morning. Dave is asking, please, Dr. Freeman, take a deep dive into the Battle of Saratoga, how it relates to Ukraine. given Zelensky's address to Congress. How many members of Congress even got that reference? And he's complimenting Carolee's students for getting it.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I take a mini dive only because the significance of the Battle of Saratoga is that it's what persuaded the French pretty much to join in. It was like it was a point at which the Americans proved that they actually had the stuff that it took to stand up and that it was worth supporting them. It was a victory. It was, a victory at the right moment, and that it helped persuade France to help support the cause in the United States. So that's, if as a reference in a speech, it certainly was a way of saying, the Battle of Saratoga is where this powerful nation came in and they gave money to these little upstarts, and what a great moment. That would be the direct relation between the two. I think that's what you're asking. Is that not right?
I think that's what they were getting at.
Yeah.
All right, we did it. We cleared the deck. The
Okay.
last deck for. Oh no, we have one more Friday of 2020. Yeah, we have one more Friday.
Yes, we do have one, which will be live.
I know. I'm so excited. I said we're doing live holiday shows. I feel like the Rockettes of history.
I know. Well, and normally I'm traveling at this time of year, and this year for a variety of reasons I'm not. And so part of me was like, 5 holiday episodes, and this is episode 142, which I forgot to say at the beginning. Yes.
Oh, is it 141 or 142? I know Carolee put it earlier.
I think it's 142, the Rockettes of history. And I will say too, those of you 142, Harvey was good and introduced himself at the beginning as someone who's here live for the first time. If there are others of you who are live here for the first time, please do tell us, because this community loves to welcome people in. So now would be, as I'm wrapping things up, now would be a moment, you first timers, to beam in and introduce yourselves. But I will indeed begin to wrap things up. First of all, I have to really, yes, indeed, Dave, I am headed right there. I do have to thank you as ever, and from the bottom of my heart, for beaming in here, being with us here on another Friday morning to have the ongoing conversation of democracy, and to ask questions and to make comparisons and to poke and prod and think about the underpinnings of things and the implications of things, and to explore how the past can inform and should inform the present. For all of those reasons, and for the simple fact that this conversation in and of itself is democracy in action, thank you for being here. Thank you for being here 142 times. I can't, is that me?
Mm-hmm. That's the quote.
Okay, I was gonna say, all I could see is that you're holding your shirt up, and I was going to assume.
Carolee has the exact quote. She can put it in the chat. Thank you for engaging in democracy every Friday morning. Joanne Freeman, history matters, and so does coffee. Indeed.
I believe that from the bottom of my heart, and I thank you every week for that reason. I want to wish everybody a wonderful, wonderful Christmas, or whatever other holiday, Hanukkah, Christmas, Kwanzaa, whatever it is you're celebrating, holiday season. I wish you really a wonderful, wonderful holiday season filled with love and friends and family and relaxing and good food and any good thing that you can find that's a good thing. You deserve it always, but you particularly deserve it this weekend. So I wish happiness for everyone here. I will be back next week for the New Year's episode. I will try and remember to include Newbie because he does beam in usually on these holiday episodes, and I forgot that today. I'm sorry, Newbie. He's preening. He doesn't care. But at any rate, and now we will turn from the regular episode to what we call the after party. What that means is that we will stop recording, thus enabling us to speak more freer, easier, to not be as really formal as we truly are during the recorded episode, but really it'll free us up to talk about whatever we'd like to talk about. If you beamed in online through the NCHE URL, if you're here through history, ncheteach.org/conversations, just stay right here. And poof, you will be instantly in the after party. If you are on Facebook, watching on Facebook, and want to join the after party, you need to leave Facebook and go to ncheteach.org/conversations. And you will click your way right in, and you will instantly be part of the after party. everybody, if you're not staying for the after party, have a happy, wonderful weekend. And thank you for being the community that you are. And thank you, John and Annie, for beaming in here, being with us on these holiday live episodes, which I so appreciate your willingness, both of you, to be here. That matters a lot.
Well, it's very fun to get to be here with everybody every Friday. So anyway, I just put a recipe in the chat because we were talking about